Faith, family, business, adventure. This is the Phoenix Podcast with Ken Sharpe.
Good evening and welcome to the Phoenix Podcast show with Ken Sharpe. Tonight I'm very excited to share our guest Sherree Shereni. This is the show where we showcase people's stories of exceptional, exciting and interesting stories of people's lives that have risen from the ashes. And tonight, Sherree, you've insisted I call you Sherree, but Dr. Sherree. Doc, tell us, how are you feeling today?
I'm feeling very excited because true stories are always very inspiring because they resonate.
And I would like to introduce Sherree formally. She's a seasoned and accomplished leader in business and society with a professional career in both the private and public sectors in Zimbabwe, across the continent of Africa and even parts of Eurasia. Her professional career and experiences ranges from central banking and financial services to FMCG, manufacturing, retail, mobile network services, digital and financial services technologies, the industry of energy and international NGOs, and even community development sectors in Africa.
Yes.
Her career includes the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe, SADC Central Banking Region, Coca-Cola Company, Coca-Cola Africa Foundation, Coca-Cola Beverages Africa, and as a franchisee of Total Energies Marketing Zimbabwe. She's also the founder of Eminence Business Academy. So without further ado, I would like to welcome you to our show. Good evening, Sherree.
Thank you very much, Ken.
So take us back, before we hear this extremely lustrous career of yours, take us back to the beginning. Where were you born? What was life like back then? And how did you get on this journey where you've ended up?
I was born in Harare. My parents were, my dad was from Sharpe, and I lived in various parts of the country because my parents were teachers, but also because of a social dynamic then. My father happened to have married a woman from the wrong tribe.
Okay.
So that came...
So which tribe was this and where was he from?
My father was from the Sharpe Manicaland region. Mm-hmm. My mother was from the Zezuru Mashonaland region. Mm-hmm. Back then, I was born in 1916. So back then, the Zezurus, because of proximity to Harare, had influences of modernity rub on them a little too earlier than other parts of the country which were separated by infrastructure challenges. So because they were a little more modern, a little more exposed to the modern world, Harare, which meant they never sleep, they were considered whores. Actually, the Zezurus and the Ndebeles in Zimbabwe, many tribes considered if you marry a woman from that tribe, they are a woman of loose morals.
Sure.
And worse still, if that woman gives birth to a girl, it's like they've given birth to another loose moral woman. So I was born into that kind of stigma and set up, and I'm the firstborn in a family. We were 6, now we are 4.
So tell me, was that taboo at the time? Was it not heard of? Did people not intermarry between tribes?
It wasn't really taboo. It was kind of like an unwritten cultural law.
Okay.
Where they preferred you marry what we call in Shona Vematongo, people from your neighborhood.
Okay. People
whom are known. So my mother happened to have trained at Tri-Seal Mission in Sharpe, and that's where she met my father. And now for a Manyika person to then cross the boundary and marry a Zezuru, it was not preferred. And that's the politer term that I can use.
Right.
It was not preferred, but the society would have wanted my dad, and he was the firstborn in his family, so they would have wanted him to marry somebody from a cultural context that was familiar to his family.
So how did that affect him? Was he an outcast?
It did affect him. He was a very resolute person, very determined, and very focused. Once he is pinned on to something that he loves, he never gave up. But it did affect his relational dynamics with the rest of the family, especially when he saw my mother being treated in a rejected manner, or just some of those social dynamics are happening between in-laws and the daughter-in-law who is not quite the right fit. It had its own problems. And then when I became a teenager, as I was beginning to observe a lot of the dynamics that were happening, because for that reason, I didn't grow up with my parents a lot.
Okay.
My dad decided to remove me from the backlash as a result of that. So I grew up in with my mother's parents, and they loved me. My mother was the eldest daughter, second child, but eldest daughter, and she was the first to marry in her family. So I was a very loved grandchild. So I actually started to really stay a lot with my parents at the age of about 12, 13. But from about 6 years onwards, I was with my maternal grandparents most of the time. I didn't see anything wrong with it until I started to stay with my parents, and until I started to see some of that dynamic playing out, because my mother didn't allow us to go and play with the other children in the village. And I always wondered why, because it was fun. We wanted to go, but she was protecting us.
Right.
Yeah, she was protecting us.
From the stigma, maybe.
Yes, and also from many other things that she felt we could be victim to as a result of the fact that we were not children of the preferred woman.
So your father stood up for his wife, his children, his family.
Oh yeah, he did.
He was willing to lose the social integration
He did.
to the larger community.
Yeah, and my name, Sherree, when I growing up at school, there was a song that used to be sung, Uri Sherree yangu, you are my Sherree. And I didn't like my name, Sherree, so I grew up with my baptism name because my parents were Catholics. I went to school with my baptism name. But come to my birth certificate, my dad dropped the baptism name. And I was always Sherree at home, and Patricia at Monte Cassino, where I went to boarding school, and other schools where I went for primary school.
Patricia's your middle name, your Christian baptism name.
It was my baptism
Right.
name from the Catholic, but it has died a natural death because nobody uses it anymore. My middle name is Gladys. I just gave it to myself because of my grandmother. I loved my maternal grandmother so much.
She was Gladys?
Yes, she was Gladys, yeah. So my dad called me Sherree, but it was the French my Sherree. So that whenever he wants to express his love to my mother, he would say, my Sherree,
sweet.
Because in our culture, it's my Sherree.
Yes.
You are called by the name of your first child. Am I Sherree? Am I Sherree? But he would just say, my Sherree, my Sherree. So I would ask I didn't like the name then. I would ask my mother's sisters, my aunts, and say, why did my dad give me this name? And they would always say, ask your dad. And if I ask my dad, he would say, you are asking me now because you are older. But I never got the answer. I actually had to figure it out myself, that this is what it meant. And then one of my aunts later confirmed that this is what it was, because my dad loved my mother so much, very, very much, to such an extent that a story is told by my aunts. My mother never really shared a lot of the details. But my aunt said at one time, the family said, you have been manipulated. In Shona, they call it kupfuwirwa. You have been manipulated by this woman through, mutis and
magic.
so forth, through magic. That's why you love her so much. And back then there was this red 10-pound note, $10 note, and he pulled it out and he said, my wife, if you know where you can find more of that, go and buy it so that you can do more of what you are doing. So it silenced it.
He wants more of those spells cost.
Yeah. So we grew up witnessing their love and their affection. It was kind of like taboo again during our era for men to show so much affection publicly to their women. But my dad did it. he would say, "Ndinopika nerunako rwemwana wekwamadyara," meaning, I swear by the beauty of this daughter of the Madyaras. So we would hear that a lot, and we would be laughing, and sometimes we'll be blushing and rushing. But he never shied from expressing his love and his affection for our mother.
And he remained faithful and loyal?
Well, he had his own miscellaneous deeds, but he remained loyal. He was a provider. He stood by his wife. He really was there for his wife. Even when he did his naughtiness and so forth, he was always very apologetic. And we could tell if something of that nature had happened. But my mother also, in return, was very protective of him. She was very, very protective of him, such that even when those issues came up, she would be very defensive.
So looking back at their life, what would you say the qualities are that they stood up against the cultural norm, stood up for what they believed in real love? What do you admire them for?
Oh, I admire them for standing with each other, for defending one another. I really admire them. And one thing that I admire my dad especially is his affirmation. I mean, he would verbalize his love. We could hear it. He verbalized it. And he verbalized even his affection towards us as his daughters. I mean, when I would get home, especially when he passed on, one of the things that really hit me hard was the fact that the moment I would move and see him on the patio with his wife having this 10-course type of breakfast, he would say, "There comes my daughter," and start showering affirmations. "My beautiful daughter, intelligent," and so much, saying so many things. I missed that. I felt it. That was one thing that I really felt the most the very first time I went back to his homestead. My dad was a visionary. He was such a visionary that he wouldn't give up on his dream. He wanted a farm, but I knew he didn't have that much money. He started trying to lease it. It didn't work out. And then he bought a farm within 3 years. He didn't want to be in debt, but within 3 years, he had paid it up. And we have inherited it as siblings. My dad, he was very well, he sent himself to school. He grew up in a family with about 7 other siblings. It was 8 of them together.
In Rusape?
In Rusape, yes. In Rusape West, in an area called Dewedzo. Yes, it was very rural. He helped send his siblings to school, but he then started doing Standard 6, and then it was something that was an exception. People could end at Form 2, which was JC then, have a certificate and you start working. But he sent himself to school. He then did a diploma, and he started working in the hospitality industry. He ended up being a manager of what is now the Cresta Hotels, the Jameson one.
In Harare?
Yeah, in Harare. And my maternal grandmother would always say, "He's the man who first took me to a hotel." He went on.
This is in the 60s or 50s?
No, this was in the 60s and 70s.
So we must have known each other. Because I'll tell you something very interesting. When I was born, we were living out of Harare in Christian Bank. We didn't have a proper house. We had a mud house with a grass roof.
Wow.
And my aunt was the general manager of Jameson Hotel.
Really?
And her husband, Jan and Margaret de Haast, my father's sister.
The name de Haast is very familiar.
I'm sure he would know them well.
Yeah, if they are still there.
So she actually took me into the hotel, and I spent the first 6 months of my life in 1973 in that hotel. So probably your father was there.
Yes, my father was there. My
Amazing,
father was
amazing.
definitely there. He trained as a carpenter and worked at one time for a furniture manufacturing company in the Coventry area. But he had a passion for the hospitality, for management, actually for business. And he ended up within the Jameson Hotel stable. He also would take my mother for holidays. When I started working, one of the things that he said to me was, "I don't want you to buy me suits or something to wear. Give me the money so that I can go with my wife on holiday." So they would go to different places in the country. He never really left Zimbabwe to go to Europe, even though it was his desire, but he did send my mother to Germany for ear treatments when my mother developed some ear problems.
So I often say in this program, you know, there's a famous writer of books. He was a Harvard business professor. He's known as the father of innovation, Clayton Christensen, and he wrote a book, How You'll Measure Your Life.
Yes.
And in that book, he had cancer, he was dying, and he was given 6 months. He lived for many years, but he said, one of the things that I've looked back at my life about bringing up children, I've begun to realize that it's not what you do for children that makes them.
Yeah.
It's what you don't do for them.
Yeah.
And I often look at that in our own lives. Many of our parents didn't have much means. And it's what they didn't do, in my case, for me, that made me who I am today. So in your case, what would you say some of the things that your parents couldn't do for you that made you more motivated and strive, hungry to actually become who you've become?
They're more difficult to think about, actually, because he sent us to school. What he didn't do for us was he didn't spoil us. He really didn't spoil us. He was a very wise man. When I started working, he took away, we found somewhere to stay. I had an uncle who worked for an estate agency, and we found a 2-bedroom flat to stay, a friend of mine and I. And I thought my dad would allow me to leave home with my bed, but he did not allow me. I tell you, we started sleeping on the floor. I was very cross with him because I had this bedroom full of furniture, and now this man is not allowing me to take this furniture. He said, I'm gonna help you to buy your own furniture, but you are leaving this house with nothing. I was extremely cross with him.
Please hold that thought, Sherree. We'll be back shortly after this commercial break.
Thank you.
Faith, family, business, adventure. This is the Phoenix Podcast with Ken Sharpe.
And we're back with Sherree, sleeping on the floor. Take us back to those moments.
Yeah, like I said, I was very upset that my dad would do such a thing to me. My mother was kind of like a little bit tense, wanted to sort of like sleep something, but my dad was watching him, watching her. So anyway, we had a little bit of money, so we went and bought some 2 plastic plates, 2 for me, 2 for my friend, 2 pots and a few things. My sister-in-law then came and gave me a little bit of a little thin mattress, and we started. But by the end of about 6 months, I had a fully furnished bedroom. We had a lounge suite. We had our kitchen utensils. So when I look back, I say, yeah, that was good.
He taught you how to appreciate things.
Yes, and he said, I will help you to buy them, because he had worked for a furniture manufacturing company. They would always give him very good prices. He says, I can help you, but you will give me the money. You will choose what you want. I'll go and pay for you, and you will arrange your transport to take the furniture home.
Tough love.
Yeah,
tough love.
It was really, I saw a different kind of a dad at that moment in time. But
So in your own life with your own children, what are some of the characteristics that your parents taught you that you've taught your children and that you'd like them to teach their children?
To be visionary, to be people of integrity. My dad was a man of integrity. His word was his bond. He would never promise you something that he wouldn't do. And if he did it, he was very apologetic. He was very humble. So even with my children, when I mess up with them, when I know I've disappointed them, even when they were young, I apologize to them. He was very authentic in himself, and I think it's a quality that I took from him in big doses.
That's beautiful. So fast forward now, take us, where did you go to school? Did you go to college, to university? Where did you study? How did you end up getting a doctorate? And how did you have such a illustrious career in all these different companies?
Well, primary school, I went to several schools. First in Mufakos at Tendai Primary School, because my parents taught there. Then I went to a school in Mondoro, where I grew up with my maternal grandparents. Then Monte Cassino, because my dad wanted me to be disciplined in the Christian faith. They were staunch Catholics. And towards the end, at around I think mid 70s, I then went and did 1 year in our home area. Then I went to Goromonzi School. I had passed very well, so I went to Goromonzi School. Then it was reserved for people who had really done very well in their academics. So I did my secondary school from Form 1 to Form 6 at Goromonzi Secondary School, and I was their head girl in 1980.
Congratulations.
Then I
in
went,
1980?
Yes.
At independence?
Yes. Yeah. And 1981, I was at the University of Zimbabwe. I did an economics degree. Then I worked for the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe from November 1984. During my vacations, my college vacations, I would work for the Con Textiles company. It was a
It was
fabric
Victicon.
Yes, yes. And it helped me to get my own pocket money. And my dad never really was demanding. He provided for everyone. I could see my other student peers, my other college mates, use even the payout from the college to educate their siblings. I didn't need to do that. My dad told me, look after yourself. You are not going to come and ask for money from me. Keep your money and look after yourself. So I didn't have that social burden that others had. And so November 84, I joined the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe in the Economic Research Department, and then rose through their various departments and ended up as the advisor to the governor, to Governor Zumba then, on SADC Central Banking Matters. It was called the Committee of Central Bank Governors in SADC. And
back then our currency was still strong?
Yeah, it was very strong. In fact, when I joined the Reserve Bank, the Zimbabwe dollar was stronger than the pound.
Can you imagine? Can you imagine? Stronger than the British pound?
Stronger than the US dollar, sorry. It was
Right.
almost at par with the pound, with the British pound. We were pegged to the British pound. It was a very strong currency. My salary was not in the, back it was, I think, 3 figures. I think it was about $900. And people earning 4 figures were the talk of town.
Amazing.
He earns a 4-figure. You earn a 4-figure salary, you were the talk of town.
So that's like hundreds of thousands of dollars today.
Yeah, that's hundreds of thousands of dollars today. But back then, with only $60, I had a budget for my month. With
For a whole month?
Yes.
From your $900 salary?
From my $900 salary after paying taxes. But back then, as a married woman, we were taxed on behalf of our husbands. So married women bore the bigger brunt of taxation.
That's interesting.
Yes, it was.
That's a bit unfair.
Because their income was aggregated to the income of their husband.
Okay, I get it.
And the law assumed that the husband would then do the provision role for the family.
Right.
But the assumption was later proved wrong, and things were
I think
corrected.
today as well, we know women are 70% of this economy. So looking back then, you're talking of 7% of your salary being enough to cover your cost of living for a month.
It was.
So 93% would then be free income.
It was free income.
Amazing.
So we managed to save, and we bought our stand in Greystone Park.
So I'm going to come back to your story because it's fascinating, but I want you to tell the audience what went wrong. I mean, from there to now, why have we gone wrong?
I think as an economist, I could say when the real sector is not producing enough, when our expenditures in the public sector are overriding the expenditures in capital investment that boosts productivity in the real sector, the sectors that actually produce real goods and services which are bought by people, you have a problem.
Powerful.
Yeah.
So the economic fundamentals are wrong.
Yeah.
We're relying too much on government as opposed to private sector, private investment, private capital to be productive, to generate the GDP that we need.
Yes, the capital expenditure of any government income statement should not be less than 20% of the entire government's budget.
20%?
Not less than 20%.
And what is it now?
The last time I checked it, I think it was in the 10% and so forth.
So less than half.
But 20% is a bare minimum. Countries that have really done well would be in the 35-40%.
So we're 4 times less.
Yes.
And is this the biggest problem? If government was to change that fundamental, would things dramatically change?
They would, because that capital expenditure is on infrastructure. You are spending it on building roads, you are spending it on providing energy, you are spending it on providing water services, things that your rail service, your transportation systems, and nowadays the digital domain is actually an infrastructure that is an enabler to business. So government's role is to provide those public goods which no single company can be able to provide by virtue of the magnitude of expenditure, capital expenditure that is required in them.
And these are permanent things that stay in the country.
These are permanent things like your dams, your energy, your roads, your air traffic, your rail traffic and rail infrastructure, all those. These are permanent things that are supposed to always be good, to always be
And
right.
these are the things that create the largest number of jobs.
They create the largest number of jobs. They also provide enablement to companies when they have produced, and for example, we are in a very much agro-based economy. If you produce your agricultural produce and you can't transport it to its destination,
It goes rotten, right?
exactly. So your air traffic systems, your rail transportation, your road networks, your bridges, all that is part of that capital expenditure that should be carved out in the government budget and be treated as a priority for the economy to grow. For as long as much of that government expenditure is on recurring expenditures like paying wages, paying salaries, civil service bills, and so forth, you are not producing anything.
So that's consumptive.
That's consumptive expenditure. And in the end, the government ends up printing money.
That creates inflation.
That creates inflation and.
So I wish we could have Professor Mtuli Nube, the Minister of Finance, sitting here. But in his absence, I wanted you to tell us a bit more about these fundamentals. If we had the ear of the President, let's just imagine His Excellency was listening to us tonight. Hearing you talk about the fundamentals being wrong, hearing you talk about the need to create jobs and invest in infrastructure, looking at the exchange rate, which you said when you started at the Reserve Bank, our currency was stronger than the US dollar.
Yes.
And looking at where we are today with the ZIG and what government recently did with this 40% devaluation, what would you say to the President of Zimbabwe?
I think let's get the infrastructure right. Let's get the capital expenditure side of the government's budget sorted out. If we fix infrastructure, companies know how to produce. That's what they are in the business of doing. And then let's provide the enablers to sectors of the economy to do what they need to do. Part of that those enablers include certain incentives for importers to bring in capital equipment which cannot be produced in this country. Provide incentives for that. For those, you remember the EU ambassador saying they have duty-free exemptions for certain imports from the EU region.
Right.
So enable industries to equip themselves with the capital that they need, the manufacturing equipment, the transportation equipment, which could be trucks and so forth, so that they can do their business. If it's the service industry, whatever it is required within the service industry. Nowadays, it's the mobile digital services, mobile networks and so forth, just allowing that. And if government spends on that, it reduces the cost of doing business. If it puts a lot of that expenditure on that, because as we are paying the taxes, much of those taxes should go into that capital expenditure. When that happens and the economy is producing, the competition among producers on its own will keep the prices down. The other things that the government will have to do is also to protect its own domestic producers, find markets, sign agreements that can help the production of domestic goods to be sold in markets outside of Zimbabwe. So which is why these bilateral agreements become important. And then, of course, the usual story, that song that has been sung, and it's an important one, value addition. We shouldn't be exporting raw materials. We should be beneficiating our raw materials right here in this country. It creates more jobs, it creates more value, it creates more income.
So the type of investors we want are those investors who actually do not extract, have the extractive mentality of taking as much raw out of the country as possible,
Yes.
but rather add value, process further,
Yes.
and export those finished products.
And export the finished product.
Because when we have more exports, then the foreign currency comes in, and that sorts out the exchange rate, because you
Yes.
now have a surplus instead of a deficit.
And domestically, there is no need now for the domestic economy, for economic agents to be going out to buy. The duty system, which has higher duties on non-essential expenditure, comes into play. Another part of the infrastructure that is very important is the education infrastructure that is relevant to the needs of industry of that economy, because we have minerals, we have agriculture, we have a diversity of resources. The education system should be tailored to produce people who can show their expertise in those areas, like in mining. So we should have geologists, we should have all those that are specialists in doing the beneficiation on mineral products. So is in agriculture, our timber, all those. So the education system should be tailor-made to suit the needs of value addition of the resources of the country.
So talk to the exchange rate a little bit. Let's assume now, we know we have a listening president, he tells us. So now we have the governor listening.
Yes.
What would you be saying to him about this exchange rate and the ZiG currency?
There's an economic principle it's a basic economic principle, very basic. It says economic agents are rational. Meaning, any economic agent, you are an economic agent, I'm an economic agent. I'm very rational to do what I need to do with my money. You cannot legislate the exchange rate. It's a factor of supply and demand.
Free market.
It's a factor of what the economic agent feels they'll get the best value out of. So you can put as much legislation as you want. The economy will just, agents will just go under.
Circumvent.
You lose a lot by doing so.
So what is the answer?
The answer is for policymakers to really just put the basic economic fundamentals into place, obey them.
So let's hold that thought. Basic economic fundamentals.
Yes.
We'll be back shortly.
Very basic.
Faith, family, business, adventure. This is the Phoenix Podcast with Ken Sharpe.
Welcome back, Sherree. This is fascinating.
Thank you.
So basic economic fundamentals.
Yes.
Tell us more about this.
Like the very first one that I've told you, that economic agents are rational. Don't think they are stupid. You can do whatever you need, but people will always gravitate towards what gives them the most value, the most bang for their buck. That's number one. Number two, the laws of supply and demand. If there is a shortage of something, the price goes up. If there is an influx of something, the price goes down. So if you print more money, what happens?
Economics 101.
Economics 101, this is not even rocket science. We are not even
that.
going into the details, into the nitty-gritties of many other fundamentals. And then the third basic, it's slightly a little less basic, but it's basic. That the structure of the economy can be actually denominated into dollar terms. Mining has a dollar value.
Okay.
Agriculture has a dollar value. So does construction. So does whatever industry, services, they have a dollar value. Hospitality, they have a dollar value. The health of your financial services sector can tell you what's happening in which sector. So if you say we want our gross domestic product to grow by 5%, there will be a dollar value. What is 5%? 5% could be $10 billion.
Right.
If we haven't, maybe it will be a growth from $8 to $10 billion. That $2 billion is the 5%. If we haven't grown to $10 billion, because you can denominate the economy into a dollar value, you can actually tell where the leakage is coming from. So if construction has not grown to give value, you can actually tell. And as you double click into the construction sector, you can actually tell where the problem is. Is it external factors? Is it internal factors? Is it leakages in the system that are happening simply because somebody got cleverer and is making money leak out of the economic system in ways that it is not accounted for? So it's very easy to do that. There are frameworks to do that.
And this is macroeconomic stability we're talking about.
Yes, this is macroeconomic.
And is this the role of the central bank, of the Reserve Bank?
The role of the central bank is actually to manage the exchange rate and interest rates. It's price stability. And the two prices that are most important for the central bank are interest rates and exchange rate. If the Reserve Bank, of course, in developing economies, the Reserve Bank has been given an extra role, like a developmental role. But its primary role is to manage two things: the exchange rate and interest rates. Interest rates, the rate at which you borrow money. So manage it such that there is a lower cost for sectors that produce real goods and services, and a higher cost for non-essential borrowing, because you are trying to curb the consumption mentality that puts unnecessary pressure on prices.
So if I was to summarize this, and then we're going to move on, would you say that what you're explaining to me is simply, and my Ukrainian partner said this, a good government is one that allows the people to feed themselves?
Yes.
So in our case, if the government has provided the framework and the economic fundamentals are in place, the market takes care of the rest.
The market takes care
You
of
don't
it.
have to be a genius to try and create a zig currency or create reserves or create printing of money. The market, a productive market, will generate enough capacity within itself to be self-sufficient.
And the role of those statutory bodies like the central bank would now be as a referee. Create the level playing field, know who is trying to outdo who, which is why the role of monopolies, oligopolies then comes into play. If they are now trying to choke out others and so forth, you are coming in there to manage that one price called inflation.
And that's why they're called a regulator, right? They're
Yes.
regulating things.
Yes, and they do it, the instruments of control are the interest rate and the exchange rate, and that controls
But they're not trying to
inflation.
legislate the economy.
It shouldn't be to legislate. Of course, there will be pieces of legislation here and there, but it is not like heavy-handed legislation that ends up choking the goose that lays the golden egg.
I love that. Don't choke the goose that lays the golden egg. So let's move back to where you were at the Reserve Bank. You had a
Yes.
great career. What
Yes.
happened then? Where did you move on to?
When I was at the Reserve Bank, I had not had the benefit of career guidance. Even when I went to university, we didn't have career guidance. So I wanted to do an accounting degree. But a brother of a friend of ours said, there's still racism. The white people don't want black people to do these commercial subjects. So if you really want to leave the university with a degree, would rather you go to economics. So we just went to economics. I didn't enjoy doing economics, but lo and behold, that's where I was. I came out with a degree. And I had gotten to know Christ at that moment. So I had prayed and I said, God, if I must do this degree that I don't want to do, then I must work at the Reserve Bank. And I did work at the Reserve Bank. I enjoyed it. I thoroughly enjoyed it. The status that it had, the learning, and at that time, Zimbabwe had the most diversified financial sector in Africa after South Africa and Egypt.
Can you imagine?
We had discount houses, we had merchant banks, we had building societies, we had commercial banks, we had a stock exchange. Not many countries had that kind of well-developed financial sector. We even had leasing companies like your UDCs and so forth. So we had a very diversified financial sector. So I enjoyed what I did, but for some reason I always felt my potential was not maximized. Whenever I heard people in the business world, in the real sector, talk about what they were doing, there were certain things that would kind of like fly off my head. And I would always want to know a little bit more. I would go and study on my own. But studying was a little bit difficult because Google was not yet there. I joined the Reserve Bank in 1984. Google only started in 1998. So we would go into the encyclopedias and so forth, and I would try to learn. But I was also raising a young family. I had gotten married a year after I started working. So I always felt that my potential was not maximized. So around 2000, the Reserve Bank did a restructuring. In that restructuring, I was effectively demoted. And I ended up, before the restructuring, I was the chief economist and the head of the balance of payments section. When the restructuring happened, the people that were reporting to me, I was reporting to them.
So unfair.
It affected me big time.
Was this because you were a woman?
Partly, the technical reason that was given was at that time I didn't have a master's.
Okay.
The reason why I hadn't had a master's was that at a time when they offered me an opportunity to go to the US to study for a master's degree, I was expecting a child. But I didn't communicate that to my bosses.
Okay.
So I simply said no. And then that no was taken to say she doesn't want to advance herself. So any opportunity for me to go on a master's program while I'm paid like other people were was just shut down.
So you left the bank?
I didn't leave the bank at that time. In 2000, I didn't leave the bank in 2000. But it set me thinking. And that's when the then governor of the Reserve Bank called me to his office and says, I know your work. I know the quality of what you do. I know the kind of person who you are. I know what they have done that they have disadvantaged you. But I had given them the authority and the power. I can't take it back. He was a very integrous man. So here is what I'll do for you. I want you to advise me on SADC central banking matters in the Committee of Central Bank Governors in SADC. So I started together with another legal person, Mr. Prince Machaya. He was the legal expert, I was the economic expert.
Two advisors to the governor.
To advise the governor. So we started traveling with him in the SADC region. Wherever there were central bank governors meetings, I was there. I was also part of the SADC, it was called CCBG, Committee of Central Bank Governors Steering Committee, to look at what we could do to harmonize trade and to improve trade within the SADC region.
So what got you to leave the bank and go into the private sector? And how did you join Coca-Cola? What is this?
When I was working, during the period that I was demoted, I started studying part-time for an MBA program. The Manchester Business School was doing a block release type of MBA. Okay. And at that time, because many of us had enrolled, they were actually sending lecturers to come and train us here. We didn't have to go to Manchester. So I started to study for my MBA in banking and finance. And as I was doing my corporate finance and other subjects within that MBA program, that's when I realized, wow, now I can understand the things that were flying past me. Yes. And as I started working for SADC, I was really just helping my SADC, the chairperson of the SADC secretariat that we were a part of, these economic experts. And I was just helping her, and she was so impressed. So she had a cousin who worked for the Coca-Cola company. They were looking for somebody with a portfolio that suited exactly what I was doing, who could help them with regulatory matters within the African region. And she referred me to her. I sent my CV, and
So this is Coca-Cola Atlanta? Or
this was it was Coca-Cola South Africa
South
at
Africa.
that time, the business unit that was
Right.
headed in South Africa. South Africa is a very big market for the Coca-Cola company.
So in the last 3-4 minutes of this program, if I was to leave 1 minute at the end, because I want you to spend it on what your future is, but in the next 2 minutes, tell me how your experience with Coca-Cola and your faith in God, being a Christian, were intertwined, and how did this all come together?
Oh, my experience with Coca-Cola was the most redefining of all experience. I still cherish it up today, and I've never seen a company that builds capacity like the Coca-Cola company. Maybe because I've been exposed to a few, but I can tell you wherever I go, my experience in the Coca-Cola company and the whole Coca-Cola system at large stands out. It trained me. It was a company that enabled you to maximize your potential, and that's exactly what I wanted, because I'd always felt my potential was not being maximized, but I didn't know what I didn't know, such that even when the opportunity to join Coca-Cola came, I almost turned it down because I was expecting also my youngest child. But God had to speak to me when I was in Livingstone at the Committee of Central Bank Governors in SADC to say, it is yours. And then I took it.
You actually heard that confirmation?
I actually heard
in
it.
Livingstone, Zambia?
In Livingstone, Zambia. And that's when I took it and I became serious with it. And we had 4 interviews. The last interview, I remember the region manager putting away the targeted selection interview document and say, start talking to me about Zimbabwe. And he got into my turf. I told him about the economy of Zimbabwe. 2 years after joining the Coca-Cola company, I delivered value to Zimbabwe. And everywhere where I went, whether it was in Ethiopia, in Zambia, wherever, even some of the difficult markets, the way they taught me, and I came through what I would call the backdoor type. My function was the least acknowledged. It was a public affairs and communications.
Unknown almost, right? I didn't know about this department, actually.
Yeah, kind of like a PR function. And if anything, I did not want anything to do with PR. But that's where I went.
So you were an ambassador?
It was even more than that. I actually derived value to see that in this role, I can deliver this value to the company. And I delivered tons of value to the company. Even when I worked for the Coca-Cola Africa Foundation, I ended up being the brains behind their water stewardship program, which is now called RAIN. A friend of me and a friend of mine called James Diet, who later left to go and study at Harvard, I was the main brains behind it, and James Diet, the organization that he worked for, we then put together.
Amazing,
the proposition.
amazing. So in the last minute, Sherree, I want you to look into the camera and tell your audience over there, that's your camera, tell them, what are you doing in the future and how are you making a difference for the next generation?
What I'm doing in the future is I've recognized the season that I am in. I'm creating sources of free cash flow for me so that it gives me enough chance to be able to share what I have with others, to empower others to new levels of self-realization. I love to see people's potential maximized, and I've started Eminence Business Academy to specifically do just that.
Amazing. Stay tuned for Eminence Business Academy, the EBA, and for finding your source of empowerment. And I believe Sherree is one of the people who help you get there. Thank you for being with us tonight, Sherree. It's been a great pleasure to host you.
Thank you very much, Ken. I've also enjoyed this interview very much.
And stay tuned, like it, pay it forward. Good evening.
Faith, family, business, adventure. This is the Phoenix Podcast with Ken Sharpe.